Tranquility du Jour, bringing you tranquility since 2005. Hello, my name is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the latest edition of Tranquility du Jour, a series of nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. In episode 472 of Tranquility du Jour, I chat with returning guest Nicole Gulotta about her new book, Wild Words: Rituals, Routines, and Rhythms for Braving the Writer's Path. Learn the 10 seasons of a writer's or a creative's life. You don't have to just be a writer to gain lots and lots of insights from this podcast. The importance of liminal space, and that's the time between what was and what comes next, and what it means to create in the margins. And there's a book giveaway, so stay tuned at the end of this podcast to learn more about how to enter. Before we hear from Nicole, I wanted to mention a few things that are upcoming this month. So December 29th, planning 2020 TDJ Style. I'm going to be offering an online free event for anyone who's purchased Year of Tranquility and or the Daybook and registered for their bonuses. And in the show notes at kimberlywilson.com/472, you will find links to this. And you'll get a private invite mid-December inviting you on over to that event, which will happen on YouTube Live. Also, those of you in DC, I've got a New Year's Eve mini retreat happening at YogaWorks Dupont on December 31st, New Year's Eve, 2 to 5. And then on January 1st, in my office in Washington, DC, a New Year's Salon, and there is one spot left for that. Also, save the date. 2 other things I want to mention is January 5th. Is our TDJ Live, our next free online 1-hour event focused on New Year, Fresh Start. This will also be via YouTube Live, and you can sign up. There's a link in the show notes, and you will get a private link sent upon registration. And then finally, we have 3 rooms left for Tranquility in Provence, and that is happening May 30th through June 5th at a private villa nestled in the south of France between Nice and Marseille. Looking for the perfect gift for yourself or someone else? Consider the Tranquility du Jour Daybook, chock full of tips, tools, and checklists for living with productivity and tranquility. You'll find seasonal layouts, monthly layouts, weekly layouts, invitations to pause, lists to complete, plant-based recipes, and so much more. This pretty planner is for the busy woman who longs to infuse more tranquility into her days while staying organized, creative, and inspired. You can find the Daybook on Amazon and at kimberlywilson.com/Daybook2019. Nicole Gulotta is the author of Wild Words and Eat This Poem. As a founder of the Wild Words community, she helps fellow writers embrace the season they're in, create at their own pace, and care for their minds and bodies along the way. She holds an MFA in poetry from Vermont College of Fine Arts, and her work has been featured in Life and Time, The Right Life, Motherly, Fathom, and others. Born and raised in Southern California, she lives outside Raleigh, North Carolina with her husband and son. Connect with her online at thewildwords.com and on Instagram at Nicole Gulotta. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being back on Tranquility du Jour, and congrats on this new book, Wild Words: Rituals, Routines, and Rhythms for Braving the Writer's Path. So good. So tell us a little bit about your latest book, right? So this follows Eat This Poem. And while you were writing Eat This Poem, you were like, my next book is going to be about the writer's path.
Well, I actually didn't know that this was going to be my second book. It was a little bit of a surprise, actually. But I was just talking with my agent about kind of some ideas that I had. And a book about creativity was something that I was considering, but I just didn't know it was going to be the next thing. And then as we got to talking, she was just really jazzed about it. And kind of got me excited. And then once I started kind of seeing a vision for what the book could be, it just really felt like it was the right thing to do. And Wild Words, at the heart of it, is really an invitation to create a new kind of relationship to your creativity. So I call it seasonal creative living. It's this idea that there is a cycle of seasons that we go through as writers. And one of the best things that we can do for our creative life, I have found in the past few years, is to just name where we are, to honor where we are for as long as we're there. And so to illustrate this idea, one thread that I have in the book is really part memoir, and it's sharing my creative history and all the lessons that I've learned so far. And then the other piece is a bit more instructive, and it offers different exercises in each season that can help support you wherever you are on the journey.
I love that because the piece that I found really helpful. Okay, I love me some how-tos,
yeah,
and I love me some memoir, right? So to blend the two, it's so interesting. It's so kind of what I long to put out into the world, and so I hadn't really thought about it as this part memoir, part how-to that you've done. But it's a tricky hybrid, and yet you pulled it off so well. I wasn't like, oh, I see this as half and half. Like it's just really. You illustrate so much, I think, with your storytelling.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, that was really the goal, was to have it all feel very blended. And then actually a third thread of the book, which I didn't even mention, is I also wanted to show through this book how to write a book. So there's kind of that other thread that was happening. I was writing kind of in the moment, showing some of the choices I was making, the challenges that I faced, because I work with so many writers, and the big thing that I hear from them, the biggest obstacle is always time to write. We're all struggling to find that time that we can work on our creative projects. And so I kind of wanted to show just a real-time example of how I was making this fit in my life at the time.
Yeah, you know what I loved, and I remember I even wrote about this on the plane in my journal. So I finished your book, on the flight coming back from Paris recently, and was just like in love with it. And I wrote, how do I find the time to write in the margins, right? Because that was your big thing. And I loved it, but I was like, man, I seem to be like, I need to have the perfect setting. I need to have everything set out. I need to have ample space, like, okay, at least like a few hours to really dive into it. And I'm like, that is such a bummer because, you give such a beautiful example of like just pulling out your phone and typing, tapping some things in and the importance of that. And if we can get away from it having to be the perfect setting, then, oh my gosh, you could write novels.
Yes, that's exactly my philosophy. And I used to have those same feelings too. I thought that in order to write, I needed those long stretches. And we actually, in order to finish things, we do need long stretches of time where we can kind of go deeper and bring everything together. But to get a first draft down, you can do that in 10 or 15 minutes a day. So writing in the margins, that's literally how I wrote the first draft of Wild Words. I often wrote it on my phone. I would go out for a walk, taking a break from work, and just type a few sentences or maybe a paragraph or two on my lunch break. And then after a month or two, you open up that document and suddenly your whole chapter exists.
Yeah, it's amazing. Because then as you're saying, okay, in order to kind of weave it all together so it like is a little more cohesive, that's when you need a little bit more of the open space.
Absolutely. But I think if you have that mindset that you can get something done in 10 or 15 minutes, that is very transformative because it does all add up and you can see it over time, which is amazing.
Right. Because there's so much avoiding, I think, that goes into it. If we're like, oh, I have to have the certain amount of time, or I have to be away on retreat and then I'll write.
Oh, of course. Of course. We all want that perfect writing day. And sometimes we get them, but I think, 95% of the time we don't have that ideal circumstance and we have to just work with what we have. So
Well, I think you raise an interesting point too, right? Because I think the vision for so many people from a creative perspective, whether or not it's writing or making jam, whatever, it's like, oh, well, if I could just...
It's idyllic.
It's idyllic, right? And if, I could just quit my job and have the time to do this full time. But you raise a really important point of like, okay, if you quit your job, that means you don't have that income coming in. And then you have all this pressure to perform, to make so much jam or to write so many things that are going to be purchased by, someone, that it's like, it squashes so much of the process.
It absolutely can. I struggled with that for a really long time. And I do talk about it in the book, this idea that, I always had this day job that felt like it was taking me away from writing and from the creative work that I wanted to do. But once I was able to kind of flip the switch and see my job more as a patron to help me pursue my creativity without the pressure, that mindset shift really alleviated a lot of strain. And it just helped me see that relationship in a new way, which is really, really helpful.
Yeah, I love that because it's like, oh, this is actually this day job that's giving me income is actually
it's supporting you.
Yes, to do the creative work.
Yeah, it's like it's a partner in your creativity, not an obstacle to it.
Right. I love that.
Yeah.
Now tell me, how was writing this book different than writing Eat This Poem? Because you didn't have Henry yet when you wrote Eat This Poem, right?
I did not. Yeah. So I think aside from the fact that Wild Words didn't involve any recipe testing that time, since it's a totally different type of book. But you're right. My life circumstances were really the biggest difference. So when I was writing Eat This Poem, I actually had a full-time job when I was writing both of the books, so that didn't change. But for Eat This Poem, I was commuting 2 hours a day by car. So that was kind of my obstacle that I needed to work with at the time. And by the time I was writing Wild Words, I did get rid of my commute. I had a different job, but my son had been born at that point. So I was working with stretches of time that were much, much shorter. And just like we talked about, some days my writing session was 15 minutes on my phone on my lunch break, and that was it. So I really had to just maximize any time I had. And I also had to make a lot of choices about how to spend my time. So in the evenings, that was really, for me, I am not an evening writer. I am basically depleted of energy at that point. So I'm not interested in spending a lot of time on my computer. But because I had a deadline for this book, I needed to make some adjustments for that year. And so I would often in the evenings after work, because that was sort of when it wasn't the weekend, that was really that chunk that I needed, maybe 45 minutes to an hour. So I had to make some accommodations to do that a couple of times a week. And then I also chatted with my husband. And at one point we were sitting down at breakfast and I just looked at him and I said, we need to figure this out. Like, I have this deadline. I have X number of words to write. And, I have a job. We have a toddler. We need to work together to figure this out. And so I had to ask for help, which is something that I don't really have a history of loving to. I don't think most of us do. But we worked it out so that on Sunday afternoons, when our son was taking his nap, I would leave the house and go to a coffee shop. So that's when I would get that longer chunk of time I needed to bring everything together. And then during the week, I would really kind of do that writing in the margins technique where I would just write in snippets on my phone here and there as I got an idea. And that's how it came together.
Yeah, beautiful. And I love how you, throughout the book, kind of share the process of that. Because, again, I think we have this idea of like, oh, well, I'll just go on a writing retreat and then I'll write the book overlooking the ocean and then I'll go home and it will get published and be a bestseller,
Right. Yeah, I think most writers and creatives, that's not our world that we live in most of the time. So, yeah, we really have to just embrace the fact that these are my current circumstances, whatever they are, and figure out what works for our life kind of month over month. So
you break this book into 10 seasons, and I'll just mention them briefly for our listeners. And then I'd like to hear how you settled on the 10 seasons, because there are so many seasons of one's life, but I really liked how you pulled these together. So there's the beginnings, there's self-doubt, there's going back in time, discontent, listening to your body, raising young children. And listeners, again, if you don't have children, you could even relate this to caring for elderly parents or caring for fur babies, things along those lines. Liminal space, which I loved, visibility, retreating, and finishing.
Yeah. So I had to think back actually to when I was outlining the book, and I had most of the season sort of sketched out before I started working on the manuscript. The really obvious ones were like self-doubt is something that is always present in the writer's life, beginning and finishing projects. So those seemed very obvious ones to include. And then some of the other ones like listening to your body or liminal space, those really grew out of experiences that I had had in my writing life up to that point. And I always like to say this is everything I've learned so far, because I don't think this is, these are the only 10 seasons of a writer's life that you can have. These are the 10 that I've identified so far that I think resonate with a lot of different people. But I'm sure if you check in with me, years from now, I might have some new seasons to add. And then some of the names for the seasons too were slightly different when I started. But the general idea, I think, was pretty much fully formed before I really got to writing.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so probably in the book proposal, you kind of sussed out the seasons and the pieces that would go into each.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk through some of the seasons, because I'll just mention, I
Sure.
love them all, right? But there's a few that really resonated, and I kind of highlighted most of the chapters. So discontent, listen to the body, liminal space, visibility, and retreating. So I thought we could just touch on a few pieces.
Of course. Yeah. Discontent, as I've been talking about this book, has been one of the seasons that is a very, very popular one. So the season of discontent is really all about frustration and blaming external circumstances for our inability to write, which is sort of like what we were discussing earlier about, being really frustrated with your day job, or maybe you're a caretaker to, aging parents, or whatever you have going on in your life. And some of it can be very meaningful and important, but it still just feels like it's preventing you from moving forward. It's keeping you from the page. And so I think we all go through these frustrating seasons. I know I've been here many, many times. And my solution to the season of discontent, and I outline this in the book, is something that I call the writing cycle of hope. So it's a 3-part framework that helps you move forward. So the first thing you need to do is to make peace with your circumstances, which we talked about. Then you need to make priorities. You need to get really clear on the one or maybe 2 things that you need to be focusing on. I think one of the mistakes that we always make is we try to do too much and we spread ourselves really thin. And so our expectations are super high, and then we get frustrated more easily. And then once you have that priority in place and you start working on it, then you're making progress. And I found that when you do things like writing in the margins, and you're consistent with it, you make just enough progress to give you that boost of energy that you need. And so you can just keep going.
Yeah. And the piece about that I love and that you just touched on is essentialism, basically, right? It's like we try to do too much. We want to take on too many things. And okay, in order to do certain things, we have to take away some others. And again, I think that's just such an important piece. We all know this, but do we practice this? And when we're finding ourselves frustrated, right, we're like, okay, well, maybe that to-do list is just ridiculously long. And some of these things could be put off for 6 months to 6 years.
Yeah, take something away. I try to have this philosophy that I learned from entrepreneur Kate Northrup, which is called do less. How can I make this easier? How can I remove something or do less of something and still make progress? So I ask myself that question constantly.
And do you find that, I just picture kind of at the beginning of asking yourself that, you're like, nothing, I can take nothing away. And then, you may find that as you ask yourself that more and you do start taking things away, I assume it's going to become easier.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think at the beginning, it's very difficult, especially, and I sort of refer to myself as a recovered type A. So I'm the type of person who used to just do all the things and I could do them well and I could manage it all. And I had the time to do it. But my life has changed so much now that I just can't accommodate that anymore without sacrificing other things like my mental health or my physical health or time with my family. So I've had to just be in the habit of practicing doing less and checking in with myself and making sure I'm not taking on more than I can handle. And it really does get easier, especially when you see once you sort of lean into it and you're like, okay, I'm going to, take away these 3 things that I don't need to do right now. And then you start moving forward and you realize, you know what? That was a really good decision. And you feel good about, why you did it. And you're able to just get even more clear on whatever your biggest priority is or the story that you need to tell at this moment. So it does feel good and get easier over time, for sure.
I think your next book should be something around the idea of recovering type A, how to.
Yeah, I should think about that. Yeah.
And one thing that I really like too from this chapter, and I just noted, this quote. I like the quotes that you chose at the beginning of each chapter, but this one really stuck. Of course, Cheryl Strayed, because she's a genius. But transformation doesn't ask that you stop being you. It demands that you find a way back to the authenticity and strength that's already inside of you. You only have to bloom. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I love that. And just the idea too, because I think about those blooming flowers, that you can just sort of stay planted where you are and it's just that perfect seasonal metaphor, right? That the flowers will bloom and then they'll, take a pause in winter and they'll come back, and that all of that is already inside of you. And you just have to, work with those ebbs and flows year to year.
So let's talk listen to the body, which I think goes along beautifully with Essentialism. And, the pieces in here, just, a couple things that I like underlined and also gave a little asterisk by, is in order to support ourselves, we need to know what restores us. And I think that this is basic, but I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know. Okay, what do I like? What do I not like? Because we're just used to doing all the things. So what restores you? I mean, honestly, genius, right?
Yeah, and it's this very simple idea, but like you said, we don't always stop to just ask some of these simple questions and to really know what makes us feel good. And I know for me and I think extroverts absolutely need to listen to their bodies as well. But for me as an introvert, I found that it is just so, so critical, because I have an energy, battery that's filled up at the beginning of the day. And by the end of the day, depending on what I do, it can be completely depleted. And so I need to know how to structure my days and the types of activities that help get that energy back. So it's such a huge part of the creative process, I think.
Absolutely. And I love what you say. It's simple, but it is not easy to know necessarily what restores us, to actually hit the pause button and be like, is this still serving me? Is this still something I want, that I want to work toward? Or am I just like doing it because I think I should?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I think listening to the body too, this is one of those seasons that it's sort of perpetual. It's just ongoing. I think there are certain times in our life when maybe the body is speaking a little bit louder and we need to deal with something in a different way, maybe more short term. But listening to our body as a creative person, I think, is just a relationship that we constantly have that is ever evolving. And I know for me, I find that when I move my body in ways that feel good, and for me, that mostly is something like yoga or walking or Pilates. And then when I'm meditating and resting, my creativity is only enhanced by those activities. And I think I talk about this in the book too, that I used to feel like I had to choose between exercise and writing. Like if I only had an hour, what was I going to do? And I hated this idea of kind of pitting these essential activities against one another, because I felt like they were equally important. But one of the things I learned, especially in the course of writing the book in 2018, was that if I chose to prioritize my body first, the creativity would follow. So that's really what I ended up with.
Yeah, which again, such a good reminder, because it can be like, oh, I don't have time to do that. And it's like, really, it's going to make a big difference.
Oh, yeah. Or you just don't want to do it because you have all these other things to do. But again, when you prune and you trim and you do less, you'll create more space for taking care of your body as well.
And, the other thing that I really like in here is this slow writing. And I don't know, have you read the book, The Art of Slow Writing?
So that book is actually on my list. I made a very conscious choice actually when I started writing Wild Words, because there are so many amazing, amazing books about creativity and the writer's life out there. And I made a mistake early on in the writing process where I started reading all these books because I
Yeah.
thought, oh, well, let me see what's out there. And you actually do need to do some of that when you're putting together the proposal because you need to have comp titles and such. So once the proposal was done, though, I didn't stop immediately. And then I found myself in, just diving headfirst into the season of self-doubt because I felt like, who am I to, write this book when there are all these other amazing ones on the shelf? So I decided to make a conscious choice to not read any books in the genre that I was writing until I was done. So I'm now at a point where I'm starting to revisit some of those books, and that book is on the list.
Yeah, it's so good. It's truly like one of my favorite writing books. And so I'll be curious to hear what you think. But yeah, whenever I saw this piece in it, I was like, oh, I hope she's read that book. If not, like she needs to. I think you'd really, really enjoy it.
Yeah, I knew of it at the time, but I didn't want to dive in while I was in the thick of the manuscript. So.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, whenever you start researching and stuff like that, it's like, okay, is this research or is it avoidance,
Oh, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I definitely went down that avoidance track for a while, and I had to just get myself out of it. So,
and listeners, a few things that she writes in here that I just want to share before we move on to the next chapter to chat about is leading. Okay, it's like, to this end, here are a few guidelines for incorporating this mindset of slow writing into your writing life. Lead with intuition, take care of your body, pursue fewer projects at a time, do what's best for you in the community you're creating, not what an expert recommends, which I appreciated that. And at one point you were like, if anyone says the word hustle, get out of there. It's like, yeah, which I appreciate. That is a bullet here.
Oh, it is in there. Yeah. That word resonates with some people, but for me, it just does not. So I try to avoid it.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's smart writing at your own pace. Don't compare your journey and honor milestones of all sizes. So again, listeners, even if it's not so much a writing process that you're doing, I think even though this started out kind of as more like creative process, and it sounds like it went more into the writing, I think anyone who is interested more in the creative process would learn so much from the book.
Yeah, I think with slow writing, especially or slow anything that we're trying to create, I think it's so easy to get caught up in what everybody else is doing. We all do that. And that essentially makes us feel like whatever pace that we're moving isn't enough. And so this idea of slow writing or just taking a slower approach to your creative projects, it sort of takes that back and says, you know what, wherever you are today, this week or this month is totally fine.
Absolutely. Right. And I think that circles back to the step one of the process that we talked about from Discontent chapter. Exactly. So this next piece, Liminal Space, which again, I really like because this is, of course, as you were talking about, even the flowers, right? It's like we're not blooming 24/7. We cannot.
Right.
And this made me think of too, I don't know if you've read this book. If not, you might find this inspiring. I recommend it all the time. It's called Transitions, Making Sense of Life's Changes. Have you ever read that book?
Oh, it sounds familiar. I haven't read it. It resonates though, so I'll add it to my list for sure.
Yeah, it's like a bestseller from, 30 years ago, but it's been updated quite a bit. But I just have not found much out there on like the liminal space, on this space of transitions.
Right.
And it's too bad because I think there's so much to be said about it and everyone goes through them and they're really freaking uncomfortable. So let's talk about what is liminal space?
So liminal space, like you said, it's a very uncomfortable place to be. No one likes being in liminal space. I define it as the time between what was and what's to come. So it's really a transitional season. And it's something that can be both creative or personal. Sometimes those things can overlap. They can be happening at the same time. It really just depends. So you might have a personal liminal space happening where there's some sort of short-term family emergency, or maybe you are thinking about leaving your job and you're not sure what comes next. Creatively, you could be finishing a project and just kind of waiting, not sure what to work on. So liminal space just kind of shows up and there's no timeline for it, which is also really frustrating. It just kind of comes when it comes. And it's really, I sort of associate it with the season of winter, because you're often forced to turn inward and sit with questions that you don't know the answers to yet, and just wait for things to unfold in their own time, which can be really, really hard.
Right. It's so hard. And I do think just the reminder of like, we cannot bloom. We cannot go 100% 24/7. And it's really important to be like, okay, maybe this is my fallow time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the sort of the culture that we have too, I think some things are shifting, but there's that kind of busyness as a badge of honor idea, or just this feeling that we should constantly be doing things and creating things and publishing things. That can sort of get into our heads too. And so liminal space is also hard, again, if you're comparing your journey to everybody else's, because you'll see other people that are out there that are doing things you want to be doing, and yet you are, in liminal space and you're not there yet. So it's even more important when you're in liminal space to kind of tune out all of that stuff and just know that, we're all on our own journeys.
Absolutely. Yeah. Really, really great and important chapter, and not a fun thing to talk about.
No. But it's great to know about it, though. I think the key with liminal space, it's one of those things that as soon as you name it, you immediately feel a little bit better. I know for me, I went through a lot of seasons of liminal space without ever having the language around it. So once I learned about liminal space, I thought, oh my gosh, that's what I was in all of these other times, but I didn't know. So I didn't know how to take care of myself during that season. So I think just knowing it is one of the first steps.
Julia Cameron speaks about this, I think, beautifully in The Artist's Way, where she says if you're baking bread and you keep opening the oven to see if it's rising,
right.
It like defeats the purpose, right?
Yeah.
And so I always try to remind people about this with regard to the creative process. If you keep kind of digging to see, is it taking root yet? It can be really, really, I think it can really set us back.
Yeah, I think at the core, liminal space it's about trust. Trust in yourself and trust in the process.
All right. Visibility.
Okay.
So this is really great too. You say the quote at the beginning: what kills the soul? Exhaustion, secret keeping, image management. And what brings the soul back from the dead? Honesty, connection, grace. So tell us about visibility.
Yeah, so visibility is a very outward facing season. It's all about magnifying your message and connecting with people. I'm in visibility right now since I had a book just come out. There are really and visibility can kind of take on some different forms. There are some more short-term seasons of visibility, like a book launch or a book tour, or if you're going to speak at an event, say. And then there are also these longer stretches where if you consistently write a blog or host a podcast or send a newsletter, those are also visible activities, but they are energetically a little bit different. So the key, though, I think with visibility is just, again, this goes back to knowing what you need to take care of yourself and building that time around your schedule, because visibility, even though it's a very fleeting season, it also can be very draining on your energy. And so you want to make sure that you are really taking care of yourself and just kind of maximizing the season and enjoying it for what it is, but just knowing that sooner rather than later, you'll kind of be back at the blank page too.
Right. Yeah. No, I love this. And I think you give a great way for people too who are like, what can I do from a creative aspect to get my work out there a little bit more, and as you said, from like social media to newsletter and whatnot. But I think the important piece is, and this ties into the next chapter of the next chapter I want to talk about with regard to retreating, but it's like, okay, you can only put yourself out there for so long.
Yep.
And then it's like, all right, when do I need to kind of step back and refill that well?
Yeah. And even with visibility, kind of, again, like we talked about with do less and making choices, I think you still have to do a lot of that pruning, even when you're in that season. So you might have opportunities to do 10 different things, to promote your book or something. And you actually need to look and say, okay, which ones are going to be the most fun? Which ones will be the most beneficial for whatever goals that I have? And actually say no to some things. Otherwise, you really risk just running yourself into the ground. So it's really important, I think, to take stock of what feels good and what you're capable of doing, even though it's a very exciting season.
Absolutely. But yeah, you cannot, be putting out constantly. And
No.
Yeah, I mean, particularly as an introvert. So the last one I want to mention, and again, what I really loved about this chapter is I was reading it while coming back from Paris, where I had gone simply to refill my creative well. And so I lead retreats. I have for 2 decades. I have never thought about the fact that the word retreat means withdrawal.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, that's genius. Of course, that's what we're doing. Withdrawal from daily life.
Yep.
But one piece I just want to read before we dive into this chapter is to hear ourselves. We sometimes have to flee ourselves, diving into silence until we're uncomfortably alone with the noise within. Oh my God.
I love
That's
that quote. When I read that, I immediately knew it had to be in the book somewhere. So
oh yeah, like gives me the chills. It's so freaking profound. So,
yeah, it's beautiful.
So tell us about retreating and why that's important in the creative process.
Yeah, I think retreating, like you said, it's this idea of withdrawing from something, and we don't need to do it all the time. Most of the time we're just, going about our day to day and just in our regular routines. But there are periods where we need to recalibrate, or we need to get back in touch with ourselves, or we need to listen to our inner voice without a lot of distractions and the noise that can be present in our daily routines. And retreating, kind of like with visibility, I see it happening in a couple of different ways. So you could go on, a literal retreat where you are attending a workshop, or you're taking a weekend away, where you are actively and physically leaving your regular life behind temporarily. But then you could also do something like walking away from social media or blogging or whatever, some of those other visible activities that you do. I started a practice a couple of years ago where I walk away from social media every summer for a certain period of time. And this most recent summer, I did 30 days, the whole month of July, I was off social media. And it was so refreshing. And then I came back, excited and, with some new ideas, but it felt so good to just step away from that for a while. And I think in order to continue to do the creative work that we need to do long term, we need to build in those periods where we can just rest from certain aspects of it.
Yeah, I remember when you did that cleanse, and you had read Digital Minimalism, correct?
Yes, I did. Yeah, highly recommend.
So good. I read it maybe around that same time, but I must confess I did not do the 30-day cleanse, and I think it's so smart. But I did notice, having read that book, which I should probably return to, my usage of it went down quite a bit. And so, it's freaking awareness, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. And it doesn't mean that you have to give it up entirely. It just means you're taking a pause, and you actually have an opportunity to, again, sit with some questions that maybe on paper seem very simple, but we don't ever take the time to do it. So when you're very consciously retreating in any capacity, I think there's an opportunity for some insight to emerge, something that you can use as you go back and kind of reintegrate into your day to day.
Beautiful. Yeah, great reminders. And Nicole, is there anything else from the book, before I ask my final question, is there anything else from the book that you would like to share with our listeners?
Gosh, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I feel like we've covered a lot of the really kind of meaty aspects of it. So I think we can move forward. Yeah.
All right. So my last question for you, the name of the podcast, Tranquility du Jour. As you know, you've been on it before.
Yes.
And how are you finding tranquility now in your days? I mean, kind of being on the part on the other side of the book where you're now in the promotional phase? Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing?
Yeah, well, I am really enjoyed actually being on this side. I love writing books and doing that deep work. But I've been saying to some people too that I also am just really appreciating not having a book deadline looming and just kind of enjoying being on the other side and seeing all of the fruition of my work now and just kind of being in that. And so what I've been doing lately, in the mornings, I've finally gotten into a bit of a ritual where after my husband leaves to take our son to school, I will turn on my kettle and brew a cup of tea and just sort of use those 5 to 7 minutes to set up my workspace for the morning where I want to write. And I find that that's really just a trigger for me to just get me in a really contemplative space. And I like to just sit and look out the window for a minute and just also enjoy a completely silent house, with the exception of my French bulldog breathing somewhere. But just really enjoy that quietness and that aloneness that I really do crave as an introvert. So that's been making me feel very tranquil lately.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Nicole. Thanks for being back on the show. And thank you for writing this amazing book.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Savvy sources. You can find Nicole on Twitter, Nicole Gulotta. You can find her on Instagram, same handle, on Pinterest, her website. You can find a link to her books, her January 12th workshop that's happening in North Carolina, and a link to our previous podcast, number 393, where we talked about her first book, Eat This Poem. Now, to enter the giveaway for her new book, Wild Words, all you have to do is take a screenshot of you listening to this podcast and maybe share a takeaway using hashtag TDJ Podcast by Friday, December 6th. By the end of the day. And then over the weekend, I'll choose someone who has done this, and you will get a copy of the book sent from the publisher. So be sure to share what it is that comes up for you as a takeaway and or just a screenshot of you listening. I would love, love, love to see it. And I have to say, I found this book amazing. I carried it all over Paris while I was there last month, and I finished it on the plane back to Washington, D.C. And I really enjoyed it. It was just like balm for the soul, for the writer's soul. I hope you too will love this book. So in the show notes, you will also find a link to share a review of this podcast on iTunes or a review of any of my books over on Amazon, and you may just hear them on the show. I wanted to share one that came up recently for Year of Tranquility. Kate writes, I use this book every single day to ground me and keep me on point with my self-care rituals. I love how it's divided into monthly chapters, so the content is always cycling and never becomes stale. Kimberly has her own shelf in my library, and she is like a warm blanket or cup of tea. Now, while I've never met her in person, still I feel after all these years she's a good friend because of her books, lifestyle, and media offerings. A true inspiration for the modern woman. Thank you so much, Kate, for sharing this. This makes me so, so happy to hear. And thinking that I could be like a warm blanket or cup of tea is like the biggest compliment ever. So thank you. And if you have a moment to pen a review, please do. It really means a lot to me. And if you pen a review on Amazon, send me the link to it. Then I will send you a postcard, a Parisian postcard that, yes, even has glitter on it. So I really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your busy lives to do this. Now, find more episodes of Tranquility du Jour at KimberlyWilson.com/podcast, and I'll also show you the app for the iPhone and Android, and then that way you get every single podcast available. And you can, of course, subscribe to this podcast in Apple Podcast or Overcast. And if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, I have a link, learn more here. I also have links to YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and signing up for my Love Notes. So this is exclusive content, personal updates, and giveaways. And it also gives you access to multimedia resources all about tranquility, which is called Tranquil Treasures. And then finally, there's also a link to my seasonless, vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion line, Tranquility. Thank you, as always, for joining me. It is a delight to be with you. I hope those of you stateside had an amazing Thanksgiving and that everyone is launching into the holiday season with lots and lots of tranquility. You'll find over on the blog, KimberlyWilson.com/blog, where I share lots of tips on how to be tranquil, how to stay tranquil during this magical and challenging time of the year. Have a great, great week, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste.